On the far edge of the moors, where fog lies like a second skin and even the moon seems reluctant to cross the sky, Blackthorn Manor waits. It is older than the road that leads to it. It is older than the mapmakers who drew the moors. It is a thing of stone and memory. A house that remembers more than the living ever can. The people of Ashcombe spoke of that house in low voices, as if the house might overhear. They would not cross its threshold after dusk. Mothers would hush their children and point toward the dark hills, saying, "Do not answer a window that looks like a face." They told of servants who arrived in the morning, pale and hollow-eyed, and left only after a fortnight, if they left at all. They told of lights that moved behind shutters though no one lived there. And always, the same name lingered in the gossip like a bitter aftertaste, the Watcher. Jonathan Hale was a man of ledger and parchment, a scholar who believed in dates and deeds rather than superstition. He had, some said, a hunger for truths that men preferred buried. When he arrived at Ashcombe, he carried little more than a battered lantern, a satchel of paper, and an impatience for mystery. He scoffed at the villagers' warnings, folding them into his notes as curiosities rather than counsel. Yet even he found the manor's silence heavier than the wind. The gate complained as he pushed it. Ivy had worked its way into the mortar. The house exhaled a breath the color of old rain as he stepped across the threshold. Inside, the hall swallowed sound. His footsteps fell like mistakes against the flagstones. Portraits hung in ornate frames, their subjects painted in fashions long out of favor, men with powdered hair and women with eyes like distant thunder. Jonathan paused before one such portrait, noticing that its subject's gaze seemed to follow him with an intent that made his skin prickle. He made a note and moved on. Curiosity carried him deeper, past cupboards where moths had learned their own slow flight, past a servant's staircase spiraling into midnight. At the heart of the manor lay the library. It was a cathedral of paper. Shelves rose like pillars, and dust hung in the shafts of his lantern beam as if suspended in time. A single table dominated the room, and upon it lay a book bound in leather so dry it crumbled at his touch. The script was cramped and urgent. The hand of someone who wrote beneath feverish light. The book told a story in the language of bargains. Lord Alaric Blackthorn, ambitious, lonely, drunk on fear and promise, had called to a thing known only as the Watcher. He had bound himself with sigils and a cup of his own blood. In exchange for years and coin, he offered a covenant. A window kept open in the house, a mouth to feed. It would not be a mortal enemy to face openly, the text warned, but a hunger that would come through the glass like a mouth. Each generation would be bound to it by kin or by trespass, and the house would breathe them into its appetite. The ink itself seemed stained, as if the writer's hand had bled across the page. Jonathan read until his eyes burned. Logical threads tugged at him. Dates to cross-check, names to verify. But the words arranged themselves about his chest like fingers. He laughed, softly, to convince himself. A myth spun for candlelight, he told the empty room. Yet when he lifted his lantern, there in the reflection of the high window were two coals of red that answered with a patience older than hunger. He turned. Nothing there but the wind and the moor. Still, the sensation remained. Something watched from the other side of the glass, waiting with the stillness of a buried thing. Night folded its wings across the manor. Jonathan lodged himself in a small chamber with a bed of horsehair and a window that looked over the courtyard. Sleep arrived like a thin fog, fragmented and full of edges. He dreamed he followed a corridor lit by candle. Ghosts. Faces turned toward him from canvas and plaster. A lullaby threaded through the walls in a language his tongue did not know. He woke once to the sound of water. A drip that was not water. Something thicker and slow. He turned on his lantern. The window drank the light. Beyond it, a silhouette stood patient as a deadline. The first sound was like fingernails over old wood. A scratching that had no urgency, only a measured, ceremonial intent. Jonathan rose, lantern held like an offering, and approached the pane. Frost flowered where the hand touched the glass, but the hand left no warmth. Only a black smear of something viscous that reflected his face back at him as if he were already inside the other world. The face at the glass was wrong in ways anatomy could not name. The cheekbone sat too close to the skin. The mouth was a riven thing, full of teeth arranged without purpose. The eyes? Oh, the eyes? Burned with a kind of focused patience, like embers tended through centuries. Its fingers ended in claws that scribed neat, deliberate marks on the pane. Around those marks, symbols glimmered. Sigils Jonathan recognized from the book, the same shapes inked where blood had dried in the margins. He should have run. He did not. He read the sigils and felt the pages of his life flutter as if in response. The thing pressed its forehead to the glass. Though there was no breath to fog the pain, the world softened at the edges. The creature, part shadow and part something that had worn the faces of many before, named him without moving its lips. The voice did not come to his ears. It unstitched itself directly into his thoughts. "You are the opening," it said. "You fed the word with your eyes. The covenant answers." The glass did not shatter. It flowed like water inward and then receded, as if the pane were a membrane rather than barrier. The watcher stepped through in a sculpture of smoke and broken bone, dragging behind it a scent like burnt iron and garden soil turned to rot. It filled the room without filling it, a presence that rearranged breath. Wings, ragged and enormous, unfurled and brushed the shelves. The manor seemed to exhale with a voice that was all at once 100 whispers and a single bell tolling. Jonathan's mouth opened, no sound came. He thought of calling for help, but the house had already sealed its intent. A portrait's painted eyes gleamed and then bled pigment. A nearby candle bowed as if in fear and went out. The watcher moved with deliberate curiosity, sniffing his collar as a hound might inspect a stranger. Then it spoke again. No longer into his mind alone, but in a tone that fractured the air, the kind of syllable that made the bones in a man's ear ache. "You trespassed. You read the covenant. You will give us a witness to remember us." As it spoke, something shifted beneath the floorboards, a whispering like pages turning in a book pressed shut. From the walls, other voices rose. Thin and many, braided like threads. They sang his name with a cadence of long nights and old despair. And then they pressed against him. Not with hands, but with the sense of attention that melted a man's resolve. In desperation, he fumbled to the table and seized the book. He flung it toward the watcher. An offering, or perhaps a fool's defiance. The demon reached. Its claws closed around the spine, and for a moment Jonathan glimpsed an eye inside that void. A cold, patient pupil, reflecting not his face, but the faces of all who had looked in and been taken. The watcher laughed, and the sound was of shutters banging across an empty corridor. A pale light, sudden and fragile as breath, flared in a far corner. Like a candle struck to life after too long darkness. In that light, Jonathan thought he saw the shape of a woman, features blurred, hands of spectral warmth. He thought of prayer, of the way his grandmother had crossed herself in the presence of storms. He forced words into the air, crude and raw, and for one crashing heartbeat the watcher recoiled. The painted mouths on the walls closed. The whispering dulled. The house seemed to register the plea of something that remembered mercy. But pity is feeble against covenant. The book had been written with intent older than memory. The words had teeth. The watcher's shadow reconstituted with terrible swiftness. It launched itself forward in an elegant, awful motion like tide and blade combined. Its clawed hand punched through Jonathan's chest as if the flesh were paper, and a pain like a bell struck inside his sternum. He expected death to be a falling away, an instant of black. Instead, he felt the house accept him. He felt his breath become smaller, then a whisper, then a syllable, and then part of him slipped into the thin places between the stones. He lingered on the threshold of existence, half memory and half voice. He watched the watcher press his hand to the window where his arm had once been and saw, reflected in the glass, another face. Pale, hollow, smiling. Previous servants, previous heirs. Eyes empty and bright with hunger. He tried to scream. His lips shaped a sound, but the only thing that left was a small, high edge note like a moth caught in a jar. The lantern toppled, rolled, and shattered. Flame died. The manor inhaled. Dawn did not come bright over Blackthorn that day. It arrived like a rumor, thin and reluctant. Villagers who passed the moors later that morning reported seeing a figure in the highest window. Small and still, outlined against the gloom, a man who seemed to have been painted into the glass. Some swore his mouth moved in silent liturgy. Children cried and refused to draw near. Old men spat into the road and crossed themselves twice. The story grew teeth, as stories do in hungry places. But the truth is smaller and more terrible than any gossip. The house does not always claim by blood. It claims by attention. It claims by curiosity. We who read words and pry at old doors are sometimes given the honor of being remembered in a way the Blackthorns intended. As voices that will whisper to the next stranger who comes near, coaxing them closer with our ache. On storm-filled nights, when shutters rattle and the moor's grasses bow to the wind, some say they hear Jonathan Hale. It is not always the same sound. Sometimes a pleading note, sometimes a deranged laugh, sometimes the soft cadence of a man reading aloud the covenant so that another pair of eyes will find it and feed. If you stand on the old road and let the night press in, you might hear him. Or perhaps the manor allows you to hear what you already need to hear. An excuse for curiosity. Either way, the window watches, and the watcher keeps its hunger. And if you ever go to Blackthorn, and you set a lantern by a window to read by its light, pause before you lean close to the pane. For there are some lines of ink that ask to be read, and some houses that are satisfied by the attention alone. Do not be quick to answer with disbelief. The house will not be hurried. It prefers patience. It prefers you.